This video is sponsored by the Sight Reading Factory. Use my code or the link in the description for 10% off your first year. In part 1 of this series, we explored in great detail that sight reading isn't an unattainable superpower, it's just a skill that you can practice and develop. And that learning to read music is pretty similar to learning to read language, and the only way to get better at sight reading is to practice sight reading. For many musicians, reading is fundamental, so don't just wish and hope. Find music that's in your personal sight reading comfort zone, whether it's etude books from your local music store or library, or a service like the Sight Reading Factory. Find some new music and get to reading. As the series progresses, we'll get into increasingly advanced concepts, but part 2 is mostly about the basics, the value of which should not be underestimated, because if you want to be a good reader, developing these basic skills is really not optional. The first thing to tackle in learning to sight read is making sure you've got a strong grasp of note naming and fingerings on your instrument. It doesn't matter if you're reading music that's basic, intermediate, or advanced. The rules for knowing what note you have to play are the same, and actually pretty simple. If you need a quick review, here are the basic rules of note naming. Feel free to pause and screenshot if you want to keep this as a reference. But if you're new to reading music or have struggled with note naming, I did 2 full videos on the subject, both linked in the description, and you should definitely start there. If you understand these rules, you should be able to name any note in any piece of music, whether it's on the staff or placed a million ledger lines away. It might be a bit tedious at first, but it's not exactly complicated. The rules are the same. The Sight Reading Factory actually has a feature to turn on annotations for note naming. Just click on Settings, add note names, and load a new exercise. Many people find this helpful when learning to read sheet music. It can act as a failsafe to make sure that you're playing the right notes. Or some people like to pencil in all the letter names for each note when they get a new piece of music. Though, while this can be a great exercise to practice note naming, I really recommend teaching yourself to read notes without added letter names. For one, it's a whole extra step you have to go through when you get a new piece of music, rather than just learning to read the notes, which is the whole point. You're also likely to miss a lot of other details, like rhythm and expression. Because you're focusing on reading penciled-in note names, all the other information seems to just fade away. And if you accidentally mislabel a note, you might never realize it because you're not actually reading the notes. And even if you do put the right letter names in, it doesn't even tell you which octave to play in, or if a note goes up or down. So actually reading the notes really matters. Just like learning to read language, note naming can be slow at first, but you'll get better with practice and probably not even think about it after a while. It just becomes natural and automatic. Of course, after you've figured out note naming, you've got to know how to actually play those notes on your instrument. Many people find it useful to keep a reference handy. That could be a labeled piano keyboard, a fretboard diagram, or a fingering chart. You've probably got one in your method book, but you can also find them online for free. Eventually you'll memorize all your notes and fingerings, but until you do, keep these references close by while you're practicing. Tip number 3 is, understand the fundamentals of reading and counting rhythms. In my experience, new musicians are often known to say, I'm not good at sight reading. I need to hear the piece first so I know how it goes, then I can play it. Now, if you're a vocalist, this might be a fair thing to say, but for an instrumentalist, not so much. Because in my experience, they're not talking about trouble reading the notes, they're talking about trouble reading the rhythm. Most people don't put up too much of a fuss about learning to read notes, but for some reason, rhythm is usually a much bigger struggle, and people are often very hesitant to work on learning to read and count rhythms. But it's crucial to being able to read music at all, let alone sight read. A deep dive on rhythms is on the way, and will be linked in the description when it's done. Hopefully you already know the basics, but feel free to pause and review or take a screenshot of this or any of the other examples that are coming up. Because I'd like to cover a system of rhythmic notation that you may not be familiar with, that can make it much easier to count and understand rhythms so you can figure them out on your own without hearing them first. We always count notes for the beat that they fall on in the bar. A bar of quarter notes isn't 1, 1, 1, 1, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And if a note is longer than a beat, like half notes or whole notes, we tie the numbers together. For rests, the rules are the same, but sometimes we put parentheses around the affected beats. If you're subdividing the beat into eighth notes, we count 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and use a plus sign for the ands. And if you're subdividing into 16th notes, it's a bit weird, but many people count them as 1 E anda, 2 E anda, and so on. All of these rhythms and rests can be put together in basically any combination. It can get a bit complicated, and I know a few of you are getting a bit overwhelmed, but please, don't panic. Learning to count rhythms takes practice, but if you're working on music that's appropriate to your level, it should be challenging, not overwhelming. If you're on level 1 of reading, work towards level 2. And don't worry too much about what's on level 42. When you get there, you'll be ready. That being said, when you see a rhythm like this, start by figuring out the counting. You might say 1, 2 and 3, 4, 1 and 2 E and 3 and 4. which is not in time, but it is the correct counting. Then work towards keeping a consistent pulse and fitting the rhythms between the beats. Something like 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1 and 2E and 3 and 4. After a couple of tries, you'll probably have it figured out. This kind of notation and counting can be really useful for dotted or syncopated rhythms, which many people find challenging. For one, if you know where the beats fall, it helps you to know whether to place the notes on or off the beat. So if I'm counting dotted quarters out loud, I usually say the second beat sort of under my breath, something like 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4. For syncopated rhythms, after you figure out the counting, you might not even say every downbeat and just focus on when the notes actually start on the upbeats. For example, 1 and 3 and 4, 1, 2 and 4, 1 and 3, 4. Again, this can be tricky at first, but I promise it gets better with a bit of practice. You can learn to sound out rhythms just like you sound out unfamiliar words. One great way to practice reading rhythms is the rhythm-only feature on the Sight Reading Factory. Start with the lower levels to build your confidence, and then work your way up to the higher levels. And feel free to turn on the metronome, adjust the tempo, or turn on playback if you want to hear the rhythm, or clap or play along with it. Struggles with rhythm reading are a huge detriment to being able to read, so make rhythm practice and understanding a priority. Next up is tip number 4. Just remember ABC. Always be counting. This is different from the ability to count and interpret rhythms themselves. In this case, always be counting means to be able to feel and lock into the pulse of the music. Knowing where the downbeat of each bar is, and being able to count along in tempo. Your internal metronome should always be active when playing or listening to music. It may be nearly subconscious, as if there's a track playing with the volume all the way down. But you also need to be able to turn the volume up and actively count in your inner monologue while playing or resting. Without this ability, you may find yourself getting lost or making errors on really easy material. For example, almost anyone with basic knowledge of music notation can look at this passage and tell you all the note names and explain all the rhythms and the rests. But I find even good musicians sometimes struggle with relatively simple music because they aren't counting. They might start off okay, but then turn these half notes into quarters. Hold this note for, a while, get lost in the rest, and come back in just whenever they think sounds right. And then have no idea how to manage this tie, all because they haven't been counting. Some people are very resistant to this concept. They don't want to count. They just don't think they need to. They just like to listen and play what feels right. And there's no doubt, there's a time to turn off your brain and just play. When you're jamming and improvising, just listen and play what feels right and sounds good. But if you're playing a specific composition with other people who are also reading, not only is there an objectively right answer, you're going to throw the others in the band off if you're just doing your own thing, and that's not being a good bandmate. So don't guess, count. Feeling is good, but counting and knowing is even better. Now if you want to count but struggle to turn on that inner monologue, here's a few things you might find helpful. Start by just trying to be aware of the beat while listening to music. Listen to the drums and the bass. Clap along with the beat and tap your foot. Next, notice the cycle of strong and weak beats. Notice that most music has 4 beats per bar, and be aware of that strong pull to beat 1. And of course, a metronome can be a very useful tool when practicing. But many people have trouble staying in time with the metronome and drift away from the beat. If the music is too challenging, you may find your ability to listen and lock into the metronome is compromised. So try ramping the difficulty way down so you can focus on counting and staying in time. Count out loud if you can. Wind players should make sure they're actively counting in their head. If you're still having trouble, try counting out loud while you listen to a friend play the piece. Then ask them to do the same for you. Then play again just counting in your head. These exercises can be really useful to turn on your internal metronome. Sometimes music is hard, but sometimes it really isn't. Don't let easy music beat you by not counting. Focus, count carefully, and execute the notation. ABC, always be counting. Next up, tip number 5 is inspect the piece ahead of time. When you get a new piece of music, before you even begin to examine the notes and rhythms, you want to scan it top to bottom and get a broad lay of the land sort of overview of the piece, while searching for and taking note of a number of different details. And a ton of those details are in the upper left section of the page right here. The time signature is going to tell you how many beats are in a bar and what note value you're counting. Next, take note of the key signature. What notes are sharp or flat in this piece? If you miss this detail, you're going to be playing an awful lot of wrong notes. Double check the clef as well. Some instruments play in more than one. Above that, you may see tempo and style markings. A few words here can tell you a lot about the sound and feel of the piece, and it might inform your stylistic and expressive choices quite a lot. And to never assume the obvious, make sure that the part you have is for the correct instrument. Next, we zoom out and look for other big details. Are there any changes in key or time signature? Any markings to indicate changes in style or tempo? And we also want to make sure we understand what many musicians call the roadmap. By that we mean any repeats or directional markings like first and second endings, second time only, or things like da capo and coda markings. You want to check these out before you start playing so you don't get lost in the middle of a piece. Next, start looking at the finer details. Not every note and rhythm, but look for notes that you may not be familiar with because they're very high or very low or have accidentals that you're not used to. You might have to look up a fingering or two. All the while, you're also looking out for any notations, symbols, or words that you don't know. You can either look them up or ask somebody what it means. You may also want to keep an eye out for extreme dynamics, and some musicians need to be mindful of instrument changes, mutes, or other special techniques. If you're sitting in a section with several people who play your instrument and there's a solo, decide who's going to play it. Finally, after you're done all the housekeeping of all those high-level details is when tip number 6 comes into play. Find the hardest parts of the piece and begin to prepare for them. If you're playing a piece that's appropriately difficult for you, you shouldn't be overwhelmed by the majority of notes and rhythms. But you will probably notice that many pieces have 2 or 3 sections that are actually challenging, and the rest isn't really too bad. In the moments before you sight read a piece, don't waste your time and attention on the simple parts. Look for the hard stuff and spend a few moments working through it mentally or even quietly practicing if that's possible. Try to figure out the counting for odd rhythms or work out awkward fingerings. You could also consider making use of the pencil to prepare your music ahead of time. You might label unfamiliar notes, write in counting or mark downbeats to make rhythms easier to understand. Or mark down certain accidentals and just generally increase the chances that you don't miss any of those details that we just took note of. There are actually a number of ways that you can use the pencil to increase your reading skills. I truly consider it a secret weapon that many musicians underuse, but that's something we'll explore in part 3. In the meantime, I really can't emphasize enough that the best way to learn to sight read is to sight read, and the Sight Reading Factory is one of the best ways to do that. You can create brand new music for any instrument instantly and infinitely at any level of difficulty. Jump around to different difficulty levels and see what works for you. Try focusing on specific keys or time signatures, or challenge yourself with full random. You can also go into custom mode and choose exactly what range, rhythms, leaps, and expression markings you want to include. Teachers can create assignments or push exercises directly to student devices. It's a really fantastic service that I think is a great fit for a lot of people. I've used the service since before I had a YouTube channel, and I still use it myself and with my students. Use the code BradHarrison at checkout to save 10% off your first year. Thanks very much to the Sight Reading Factory. As always, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and check my channel for more videos. Good luck sight reading, and we'll see you in part 3.